Do we have some questions?
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. Quick question. I know you did not address this, and I don't know if you do so in your book, but during the era that you're focusing on, I'm wondering if you could possibly speak to gay women and women of color, in particular, those two who were not able to transition from inner cities to the suburbs.
No, yeah, absolutely. So you know, the women I write about would say that this is about larger issues that have nothing to do with race, but the point I really underscore in the book is this is a completely racialized politics, right? What are they advocating for? They're advocating for what they call the traditional nuclear family, this idea that women are in the home and men with a male breadwinner, right? This, although they don't directly address race, given that this option was only largely available, especially in the post-war moment, for white heterosexual couples, right? Just basically they found themselves advocating for a form of politics that was largely only available to white people, right? So, you know, they like to say things, they would often say to me, well, this is completely colorblind, we would take anyone in there, but, you know, in this moment in particular, they are advocating for an option that is only really available to white people. Now, it's an expanded definition of who's white in the post-war moment, right? Like, a lot of them are you know, Southeast European ancestry, folks who were not considered white. But, you know, throughout the New Deal, and especially with the GI Bill, when their husbands were able to qualify for it, and when they were able to qualify for those FHA mortgages in redlined suburbs, that was when their families officially became white. So it's a deeply racialized politics, you know, and it's one that is predicated upon, you know, heteronormative nuclear family, absolutely. So yeah, this politics would exclude women in those groups, absolutely.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. I guess as I sit here and think about that era, I grew up in the 50s in southern Bergen County, which had its share of people from New York. And most of the families I knew did not have 7 children, and they were Catholic. I was not, but the community certainly was. So, as with this whole argument that's been co-opted by Phyllis Schlafly's group and beyond, it seems to me, well, I actually want to know, did you in any way speak about birth control? I mean, in the 60s, of course, birth contraceptives became possible, and you know, there was a big push on that. And I would also suspect that many of the women you spoke to either had or knew somebody who had an abortion and never discussed it. The whole issue, in my opinion, has been totally co-opted by the other side. So the 1 out of 3 women who have had abortions are not, very few of them are doing the shout out your abortion.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, they certainly would never admit that to me by any means. The women I interviewed largely were very devout Catholic women. So there's sort of a spectrum of women. These would be women who are, you know, attending the priest's weekly dialogue group, right? All of them, at least as they presented it to me, one, they're from the middle class, but comfortable enough in the middle class status that they didn't at least ostensibly engage in family planning. They did not believe in birth control, which was largely at first only available to married women like themselves, because they saw that as against the Catholic Church's wishes. They certainly, probably a lot of these women have not had abortions, but I am sure that, you know, these are the same. If for them, maybe they never came into their worldview, but maybe they would decide differently if it were based on them, right?
I've told you.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't have told me. But you know, a lot of them actually, the central organizers, I don't know, they had upwards of 10 children, so I'm gonna guess they didn't. But what's very interesting is that they often come from families that are 1 or 2. I would say their mothers would have been much more likely, and they would never tell me about that. I mean, their mothers were really living on the edge of poverty, and being pregnant was grounds for being fired. In many cases, their parents, not only were their mothers working, they might have been the sole breadwinner because women found employment more readily in the in the 1930s and the Depression than men, because you could pay women less. So if you could hire a woman, you hired a woman. So I would definitely say that it's definitely possible that their mothers engaged in family planning or had an abortion. But I think for them, the ability to have, at least what I've sensed from all these interviews, the ability not to control family planning, right? The ability to have upwards of 10 children was seen for them as another status marker of having finally arrived in the middle class. It was sort of baked into this identity as first generation suburbanites, first generation middle class. It was something they were proud of, that they could do that. So I don't know if that, certainly they wouldn't tell me if they had, but I would bet if anyone in their family had an abortion, it was most certainly their mothers. Their mothers at least had to have had different ideas about birth control, right?
Hi, I'm going to piggyback on that because that was my question as you were talking. Did you in any way in your questions actually ask that talk about, did you know anyone who had an abortion? So that was one of your questions.
Oh yes, but these are the women who are not only not having abortions, they're the women on the picket line outside the clinic, right?
I mean, they had to know someone. I mean,
presumably, absolutely.
If they came from anywhere in that area,
I would say absolutely.
they had to know.
They had to have known.
Raped, someone who had an abortion because of rape, they had to know someone.
I would say it's probably impossible to go through your life and not know someone who's had an abortion, but I would venture to say, in their world, their closest friends were the other founders of the New York State Right to Life Party, right? In the moment that their politics really shifts, they become political and switch allegiances from the Party of the New Deal to the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Their whole lives and social circles are surrounded by other women like them, right? These first generation homemakers, suburbanites. I'm sure they must have known someone, but they certainly wouldn't be. It was really seen as not just antithetical to their beliefs about family, their beliefs about religion, but really it was a marker of identity as much as it was, buying the latest car with a tail fin, right? The ability to walk around and to have 10 children, unlike their mothers, and to stay home full time was a status symbol for many of them. And it's because they had clinched that they had such a, although feminists, liberal radical, are very much talking about choice. And in fact, it's feminist groups like National Organization for Women who actually pass the laws that help homemakers, right? Because they were oriented around choice. If you want to stay at home, we want to pass laws that will make you as successful as a homemaker as possible. If you want to work in the paid workforce, then we want to pass laws that will make that as easy for you and as fair for you as possible. So feminists are very much talking about choice and talking about how they're not opposed to homemakers, but these women, despite that language, these women perceive it. Just, you're offering a choice? That must mean that my prize is less valuable. That's how, they don't even listen, in other words. Oh, sorry, maybe I must have.
I just had a question. I grew up in northern Bergen County, up in Ramsey area, and I am a product of that, group. And I remember the parents and everything being very upset that the Catholics came from the city and came into the suburbs. Mm-hmm. So did they feel that hatred? I mean, because it got to some point where it was, and they segregated themselves because the priest said, you cannot, like Girl Scouts girls could not go in a Protestant church for a service.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so was that felt? I mean, did these women talk about, that's another way they were isolated?
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
The suburbs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, given just where they're coming from and where they're going, the types of suburbs they're migrating to are sort of further up. They're not like the bedroom communities closest to the city where more affluent suburbanites first settled in the 1920s. They're settling in places that was farmland until the GI Bill after World War II. So they're in a different kind of suburb that tended to be first generation suburbanites, or if they're in a suburb that's more established bedroom community like a Ridgewood, they would be in the section of the new post-war, right, post-war development. So they find themselves, just because of economic factors and when they arrived in the suburbs, being with other folks that were like them, and then segregating themselves, right? Not sending their children to public schools, right. Sending them to Catholic schools oriented around the parish. Again, it's very disorienting for them in this new world. They want at least their children to have some semblance of the same education they had in the city, right? So they really lead these insular lives where they're in the suburbs, they're not engaging with the full suburb, but just really with their Catholic community.
Right. I mean, for us, I never went to school full-time because of the population explosion of children, not till I was in 6th grade. And in the Catholic schools, there were 2 kids in a seat, 50 kids in a classroom. So that, again, was a whole different dynamics as far as we know. But just as an example, an experience of the shame of having an abortion, this was in 1972. I had just gotten married, so I became the cover for a high school friend who came up from the South to have an abortion in New York,
right?
And stayed at my house so nobody knew. And another friend and I drove her to the hospital, picked her up, and literally that same day just got her on a plane to go back home. But to this day, as high school friends, I don't think anybody else in the group knows except the 2 of us who were.
Right. And in 1972, if you encountered picketers outside the clinic, these are the women I'm talking about,
Yes.
right? Because when New York State legalized abortion in 1970, their activism in these growing populous suburbs was responsible for the New York State legislature repealing that law 2 years later in 1972. It was, so basically they had pushed lawmakers who had passed the nation's most expansive abortion reform law in 1970 by getting involved in politics, making their presence known with their third-party activism. They were able to push lawmakers to overturn the abortion law just 2 years later. Of course, it was saved by Governor Rockefeller's veto pen, and it was preserved, and then the next year kind of became a moot point because the Supreme Court weighed in at the federal level, so state protections were no longer all that people had. So these were the women. They were not only, I would venture to say, not having abortions themselves, but probably knowing someone, at least in their earlier years, who did. They are on the front lines. They were at clinics in that 1970 to 1972 period, pushing the state legislature to outlaw abortion.
This lady over here's got a... No, this lady over...
How are you? Good. It was a great talk. I wanted to see, how do your thoughts and perceptions change from when you wrote this book to today? Obviously, the political climate is very different today than it was even 6 months ago.
Right.
So, what do you see the state of what we're in now and where we're going, and where would you like to see it go?
Well, where I'd like to see it go is not where we are today, personally. But what I will say that this I really uncover in the book is, people look at, let's say Trump, a very unpopular president. The voters I'm talking about, and going forward to today, they are so committed to issues like keeping abortion illegal that they will vote for someone who maybe offends them on a variety of levels, indifference to the poor, but even more so, things that even the Pope, the head of their church, is opposed to, right? But that's how central issues like abortion became in their lives. So I think that in terms of today, the voters of today who you wonder, how can abortion really triumph over everything? How can this family values politics triumph over everything else that they presumably believe in? This is really what I'm talking about. This kind of gets at it, because a lot of this is not just about partisan politics for them, the who's up and the who's down, sort of horse race aspect of it. They see it as it's religious to them, but it's really like integral to their personality. To not vote with these issues at the forefront would be to put aside something that they have oriented their entire adult lives around, this commitment to, say, full-time motherhood or something like that. So I think that in terms of today, it really helps explain how someone could continue along with a politician that they really are opposed to, just for the promise that he would appoint conservative judges who would potentially outlaw Roe versus Wade. So that's it really gave me a window into that type of politics, which I think a lot of people sort of struggle to understand today, right? Like, but he's committed crimes. You know, this is why, because to not vote for someone who could, say, overturn abortion is to almost vote against who they see themselves as, right? A commitment to their own identity.
Just one moment. A number of us have lived through this period, but I noticed that we have some younger folks here who have not. And I'm wondering if any of them would want to talk about what they find about your research surprising, or if there are any concerns that they may have, about, the revocation of Roe versus Wade, or some of the other, family values, things that are going on right now. And I don't mean to embarrass any of you, but I'd like to take it.
First of all, when you opened, it sounded like you were talking about today, with the tiny middle class and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I can certainly see why they would vote for somebody who was otherwise despicable. Because I would never vote for somebody who was anti-choice.
Right.
I just wouldn't do it. And you were saying before that the New York State's law was virtually moot until now.
Well, right, yes. Living so close to New York, many of us will feel fortunate to live so close, because presumably that law will be what we can rely on, maybe? If it's overturned.
I'm going to go now.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Hi, I've been patiently waiting. So I guess I'm the token young person in the room. My grandmother was a flapper, and she worked, and like you were talking about, a lot of men couldn't get jobs, but they would pay the woman less.
Right.
And as a young child, I saw the fur coats and the parties, she had pictures and everything else, and I thought she was such a cool woman. She had my mother very late, and as I grew up, I didn't understand politics, I was a young child. My mother was a hippie. So she was literally the now woman, and my grandmother, the flapper, became this conservative suburbia housewife, right?
Interesting, yeah.
And it's funny, it all makes sense as you're talking, but as a young college woman, I was like, wow, I have like two activist women in my life, so it's very interesting to see, like, you explained it so well, how it went from one end to the other. It was a very nice job. My second point I wanted to make, now there's so many more questions I have because as other people talk,
Read the book.
But, history repeats itself, which I think someone else mentioned. Affordable housing is like a big deal right now in Bergen County, and it's the same argument. It's the same argument. We're colorblind in here, our areas are colorblind. Everyone is allowed to come in. Well, no, only certain people can get this affordable housing, which is through the GI Bill at that time.
Right.
Now there's only certain people here that can live comfortably in our suburbia areas.
Yeah.
So I wish the political leaders and people working on these programs would learn more about this, because they probably don't know the history themselves.
Right. Yeah, now we fight a lot about it in this community, right? Because it's actually in this era where middle class identity gets cemented to single family home ownership, and that becomes racialized, right? It becomes where white people live in the suburbs in single family homes, and multifamily housing becomes associated with with cities and pockets of poverty. In other words, those people who didn't qualify for the ability to move to the suburbs. So now we talk about things like high density housing as code for like multifamily is code for non-white, right? So it's a very much a racialized politics that first gets cemented in people's everyday imaginations in this moment, right? As we're creating a suburban middle class predicated upon single family home ownership in the suburbs that happens to be completely racialized, only open to white people, right?